Hello, everyone. Welcome to this very special edition of Through Conversations podcast, where we explore the truth through conversations with the most brilliant minds. Today, I'm joined by the brilliant Professor Rebecca Henderson, an economist, a professor, and an author who has been called one of the world's top thinkers on capitalism and sustainability. Henderson is a professor at the Harvard Business School, where she teaches courses on corporate sustainability and innovation, and has more than 25 years of expertise, sharing her insights widely on topics ranging from organizational change to climate change. Her most recent book is Reimagining Capitalism in a World of Fire, one of my personal best, my personal favorites, which we'll discuss today. And in this conversation, I want to get to know Rebecca Henderson, her trajectory, and also her ideas on our current economic system, its flaws, its perks, its benefits, the role of business in addressing these challenges, and the practical steps that companies can take to become more sustainable and more accountable for the future. So, Professor Henderson, thank you so much for joining me today.
Alex, it's a pleasure to be here. Thank you for the invitation and for your very kind words.
Thank you. Thank you for joining me. I'm very, very excited and enthusiastic for this conversation. And I want to start off with your trajectory. How did your trajectory unfold up until today? And how did it influence the way you see our current economic systems, their opportunities, flaws, and their potential?
I grew up in London. I'm British. And my very first job was working for a major consulting company. And this was in the early 1980s. And working for a big consulting company in the early 1980s meant closing plants in Northern England. This was a time when the English economy was really reeling from global competition, particularly competition from Japan. And I found myself working with firms that had been household names for over 100 years, and yet were seemingly blind to what was happening in the world around them. And that really fascinated me. So when I went to the US to do my PhD, I focused on that question. More broadly, what drives innovation and change in the economy? Why do firms have so much trouble changing? What makes an economy grow and change? And it was really fun. I became a professor at MIT and ultimately became the Eastman Kodak Professor of Management, which was a hoot because it was complete coincidence. But that's what I did. I studied firms like Kodak that, you would have thought everyone in the world could see, for example, that digital photography was coming, except Kodak. And so what is it about organizations, about humans, that makes it so hard to see that the world is changing and to respond? And about 15 years ago, two things happened. The first was that my brother, who is a freelance environmental writer, started sending me the science on climate change. And I read it and I thought, ooh, not good. And maybe I should stop being a business school professor, because here I am, I'm just teaching MBAs, I'm just oiling the wheels of corporate capitalism, and, the world is burning and it's going to get worse. So that was the first thing. And then the second thing was that energy companies started showing up in my office, because I was a specialist in organizational change and long-term strategy. And these energy firms could see climate change too. And they were thinking like, well, how do we react? What should we do? And in fact, it was my friends, my activist friends, who suggested that I should stay as a business school professor. They said there's no way we're going to deal with these problems unless we get business engaged. And I continue to think that's absolutely correct, that without the innovative capacity and the skills and the reach of business, we're not going to be able to respond to the huge problems we face. Now, it's clear it's not business alone. I don't think business can save the world. I think business can play an important role in responding to the issues we face. And so I helped start the first course in business and sustainability at MIT. I was recruited to HBS, where I helped to found the Center on Business in the Environment and started teaching courses in this area. And then about 10 years ago now, I started the course that became Reimagining Capitalism in a World on Fire. And it really unites my study of innovation and growth with my passion for the issue of climate change in particular, but more broadly for problems like inequality and racial equity as well.
That it's really, really interesting. And two ideas coming to mind that, as a former student, I'm curious to know, how did your students receive and how were they interested in this intersection between and your passion for sustainability and also for our economic systems? How was that received by your students?
So I was really nervous. When I designed the first version of this class, and this is some time ago, before this was like a fashionable issue, I didn't know what was going to happen. So I did a very low-key first class. Only 28 students showed up. We had a fantastic time. I mean, it was so much fun. And the next year, 387 MBA students showed up for the class. That's more than a third of the student body at HBS. That was like, wow. It was the fastest growing elective in a number of years. And the students were just on fire about it. Now, nearly all the students understand how important this is and are really engaged. And we have many classes in the space. In fact, Reimagining Capitalism is now a relatively small part of the offering because we have like 10 or 12 classes in this space. But at the time, it was the first class that really said, what do we think about capitalism? What do we think about these big problems? How can we make a difference? So it was fun. I mean, the students were totally engaged.
Oh, that's amazing. And it's encouraging to hear because, an engaged student body means that in the long term, those become our leaders. So those become to start making decisions based on your ideas. So tell me some of the success stories of your students were you able to get in touch with them after they graduated and they said like, hey, Professor Henderson, your ideas made me do this in my business or X in my decision-making process, in my leadership? Was that a conversation that ever happened?
It actually happens a fair amount. I put the course up online too. So you could take the whole course online with videos and you would walk through case discussions and so on. And thousands of students have taken it online. And so I now have, gosh, this is going to sound like boasting, but I mean it really to answer your question. I have 11,000 followers on LinkedIn. Seems like a lot to me. And a huge fraction of them took my course and they're saying, this completely changed the trajectory of my life. I decided I needed to do something. I founded a new company. I mean, one example is an ex-student of mine who founded a company focused on energy poverty. And she said, we had the radical idea that the way to focus on energy poverty was to focus on energy poverty. So, what we do is we get renewable energy to people who otherwise wouldn't have access. And she had, I love this, 7 female PhDs in her founding team. I was like, that is way cool. But no, I hear from people from all kinds of sectors. One of my students I met with recently was at the COP that just closed, working for her firm, which is a big textile organization, and just sort of observing and participating. So there are people in very large organizations. There are entrepreneurs. There are people who have gone into politics. One of my old students works for the Long-Term Capitalism Initiative, which is all about trying to persuade investors and firms to focus on the long term. So they're all over the place. And I'm sure there are many, many that never bother to get in touch. I mean, I hope there are. And I hope it makes a difference. And, Alex, something I want to say, though, is, it's about my stuff and my course. And wow, this has been happening across business schools everywhere. And I have an amazing group of colleagues across business schools across the world who've been working this agenda. And we've all seen this uptake in interest. Sometimes people say business, climate change, business cares about the public good, and it sounds very countercultural. And I can understand that given how many horrible things business has done. But there are thousands of people in the business world who are trying to make a difference. And, my students are part of it, but it's part of something much, much greater.
Absolutely. And not only your students have gotten the benefit of learning from your ideas, you've also taken your time to write Reimagine Capitalism in a World of Fire. And people like me have read your book and have created a new framework of thinking how do I engage in these situations and in our current economic systems, in this case capitalism. And it makes me reflect on how my own individual actions can really have a ripple effect, not only here, not only in the present time, but also for my children who are not born yet, but for my grandchildren also. And thinking on a long-term basis as well. You know, as young people, we're not really encouraged in today's world to really think long-term, especially with social media and especially with all of these instant gratification, you know, technologies that are happening across the whole spectrum. And your ideas have made me think on a more humble way in my own time. How can I create this golden rule with future generations as well? So thank you for that. And with that preamble, I would love to get into your book, Reimagining Capitalism in a World of Fire. It's a very, very great book, very great read, a page turner, as I told you before. And I'm very curious to know, you know, you began your research on this intersection between sustainability and economics and capitalism. So one of the biggest arguments in Reimagining Capitalism in a World of Fire is that you argue that its current form is failing us, that capitalism in its current form is failing us. So is this still true today in 2023? And can you explain why would that be the case?
Absolutely. And let me begin by saying I'm a fan of capitalism. I'm a professor at the Harvard Business School. I think in its best incarnations, capitalism is an unparalleled source of growth and prosperity and innovation. And as I said, that we can't solve the problems we face without it. Just some very basic statistics. I mean, GDP per head has more than quintupled in the last 100 years. So that's 5 times as many goods and services for every human being on the planet as there were 100 years ago. And that's at a time when the population of the world has more than tripled. So, you know, there's been this explosion in wealth and resources. And I mean, we lead lives I think even our grandparents could hardly have dreamt of. So lots of good things to say about capitalism. But I think for capitalism to deliver genuine prosperity and well-being, a couple of things have to be true. And to drop into economic speak for a moment, externalities have to be properly controlled or priced, and markets have to be genuinely competitive. And there has to be no market failure, no overt collusion, real information, everybody can play. There's a whole list of conditions that make markets really work well. And the trouble is, markets don't work that way on their own accord. If you just set up a market and there's no government or civil society controlling it and balancing it, what you get is crony capitalism. You get a few firms running everything and, you know, a very complicated relationship with the politicians, which I'm going to call cronyism. But basically, a few rich people control both the politics and the economics. Think Putin's Russia, think various forms of state capitalism that, to avoid being overly controversial, I won't name. But that's not the capitalism I'm a fan of. What I like is genuinely competitive markets, lots of firms entering, and externalities, that is things like pollution and waste. One of the externalities I like to think about is noise, right? Mm-hmm. So a huge factory sets up next to you and starts throwing its garbage into the river and making huge amounts of noise and emitting pollutants that make you sick. If that factory is simply maximizing profits and there's no way to control all the stuff they're doing to the community around it, that's not necessarily maximizing social welfare. I mean, in fact, for a coal plant, it's creating much more damage in terms of health damage and climate damage than it is in profits and revenues to its shareholders. So every coal plant on the planet is actively destroying long-term value, long-term social value. So I'm a huge fan of capitalism, but we let it become unbalanced. And there's always this tension between markets and the state, between firms and government, is always there in every society. Because let me be clear, uncontrolled government, not a good idea either. That's, when government owns the economy and, you get Soviet Russia or something like that. Not a good idea. So the whole thing is about how do you keep the tension between the two? What's the right balance? And as a horrible generalization, people who are more conservative like less government and more market, and people who are more liberal like less market and more government. But what we've gone through in the last 50 years is an ideology that said free markets can do it on their own. We don't need government at all. In fact, that famous phrase here in the US, the best government is one that you drown in the bathtub. President Ronald Reagan said government is the problem, not the solution. And what that did is put in motion a whole train where we basically gave business free rein. And that meant most obviously that global warming pollution is not controlled or priced in many parts of the world. So you can legally emit huge quantities of greenhouse gases that often have very negative effects on people's health. Millions of people die every year because of the pollution emitted by burning fossil fuels. And we've got a climate that looks as if we're at risk of destabilizing. Fires in California, floods in Bangladesh, fires in Australia, sea level rise, in Miami. And some people making like Canute, right? Well, somehow there'll be a magic technological fix and it'll all be okay. It's not going to be okay. I think that's becoming really, really clear. We're poisoning the ocean. A lot of the greenhouse gas pollutant is carbon dioxide. That's turning the ocean into an acid bath. Plus, we're fishing everything out. We're cutting down all the forests. This is not good. So, capitalism is a problem. Our current form of capitalism, and I'm generalizing horribly, of course, there are worse aspects and better aspects, but in general, we have a serious problem.
Wow. So it makes me think on this concept of, how people speak on politics and the systems, the political systems in terms of the lesser of the evils. So democracy is the lesser of the worst that we have. We don't have socialism, we don't have communism, so let's stick with democracy. Do you think this holds true with capitalism? Is that the best of the worst that we can have?
It's the best that we've discovered so far. And we have a good sense of how to make better forms of capitalism. We know that pricing externalities, that really having smart labor regulations so big firms can't push wages to the bottom, that we know having decent education systems, healthcare systems such that everyone gets a chance to compete in the market. At the moment, if you grow up in the US in the wrong zip code, it's like starting 500 feet before the start line.
Yeah.
Right? You're born like 500 feet behind everyone else because, you maybe have a single parent who's working 2 jobs, who doesn't have education. There are no books in the house. You don't have proper healthcare. Your brain may be significantly adverse affected. And so do we have an equal labor market? Can everyone have a chance to fulfill the American dream? No. Labor mobility, which is a wonky way of saying the odds of moving from the bottom of the income distribution to the top of the income distribution, the labor mobility in the US is amongst the lowest in the developed world. And don't get me wrong, I came to the US because it's a country of opportunity and anyone can do anything. And I did my degree at MIT where I loved it. Didn't matter if you had, tentacles and purple skin. As long as you were smart, that was all anyone cared about. But there's an important group of people for whom that's not true, who don't have access to the American dream anymore. And of course, there are many countries where, there's so little development that despite huge advances in the emergence of a new middle class in so many places, which is great, like Africa and India and China, there's still a lot of people left behind. So it's always, yes, capitalism, because innovation and competition is amazing. And private ownership of assets is fantastic. We don't want the government owning everything. But it has to be balanced. Antitrust law, labor regulation, carbon regulation. And there's always going to be fights about how much antitrust regulation and how much carbon, what should be, how do we, but that's great. That's what democracies are for. But then the other thing that's gone wrong, and I'm sure you've already talked about this on this podcast, is, we talked a lot about government, but the other important actor here is an informed civil society. That is citizens who have an understanding of what truth is and are committed to the good of the whole society and are comfortable disagreeing, because in the end, what matters is the good of the whole. And partly, there are many reasons, what's happened to capitalism is not the only reason, but partly because we haven't been paying attention to inequality, and many people feel as if they don't have a chance at the dream and their children don't. And the elites have fixed the game, rigged the game. We've got a lot of political anger. Mm-hmm. And as you know, I'm sure you've talked about this, social media has led to, what's sometimes called the decline of truth. Mm-hmm. I have really good friends who are vaccine deniers. And I'm like, really? I've seen the peer-reviewed science, but no, the peer-reviewed science is rigged. And this is because, I think partly because the elites, and we could unpack what that means, but the elites have been seen to be like making out like bandits while everyone else doesn't do so well. And meanwhile, the earth is burning. So it seems to me, and I kind of understand why people say, well, you're the people with all the truth. Look what a mess you made. So that dynamic is also happening at the same time, and our societies are fracturing, and we're getting a kind of move to authoritarianism and to hate. In the United States, as I'm sure you know, members of both political parties are increasingly seeing people in the other party as somehow stupid or evil. That's a huge problem. Just because we have different political views doesn't mean we're stupid or evil. But again, we're fracturing as a society, so we tend to talk to people like us, and we live in our own little thought worlds, which is all by way of saying it's not just capitalism. I meet young people who say the system is broken, let's tear it down. And I think that's an actively terrible idea. We need to rebuild and reimagine and rethink. We have some idea of what makes for a prosperous society, but sort of tear it all down, the bastards, it really leads to trouble. And I found myself saying on one podcast, which is not something an engineer and economist says very often, what do we need? We need love and respect and empathy and compassion. and one of the reasons I talk about reimagining capitalism is, but I'm going on and on. Yeah. Sorry, Alex.
No, it's amazing to hear you and to listen to you, and you touch on so many ideas that are really breathtaking and honest and sincere, and it goes into your whole idea, to your whole concept that you were mentioning before. The perks of capitalism are undeniable. The GDP growth in per capita is undeniable. People are getting more access to opportunities. The thing is, how do we build on that momentum? How can we capture those great perks of capitalism while toning down the risks for all of us, while toning down all of the externalities that you touch upon, which are very important? And it's really interesting because you also touch on the elites and how this becomes a conversation that, so you're the elites, you're the ones with the resources, you're the ones steering the ship. How come everything seems to be tearing down? How come everything seems to be on the brink of collapse? So this is a very interesting conversation to have, and how you touch upon political views that at the end of the day, differing positions are not an insult to your identity. That's what people need to understand, that my way of achieving prosperity for me and for my future family may differ from yours, but that doesn't mean you're attacking mine. That doesn't mean you're interfering with mine, which is brilliantly put by you. And I want to get into that question, that idea that you say, which is very important, that we have the momentum. At the end of the day, capitalism is still working, because if not, everything would have stopped for now, like you say.
The lights still come on and the planes still take off and the food still makes it to the shelves. We shouldn't take this for granted.
Absolutely. And right. Like you say, I'm very curious to know, how can we begin to unpack the wins? How can we capitalize on the wins? That was a very pun intended, capitalize on capitalism. Sorry. So how can we capitalize on really what capitalism has made for humanity, and then turn it into a conversation that, look, we're winning. Right now we're in a winning position, but it might be the bottom of the 8th inning or bottom of the 7th. We're singing the Take Me Out to the Ball Game anthem in the ballpark. So we have 3 more innings to go. I don't know your time frame in terms of is it too late to turn the page, but if I'm explaining myself correctly, how can we turn this momentum to our favor?
Sure. So firstly, it's never too late. We always have to act. It can get worse. That doesn't let us off the hook. Arguably, there's going to be some really rough times ahead. That doesn't mean we shouldn't do everything we can to make sure it doesn't get rougher. So I'm British and female, so sports metaphors, not my thing. But we certainly have time. We certainly have time to head off the worst impacts of climate change and to begin to heal our societies. So how do we do that? How do we capitalize on some of the amazing efforts that are happening? So one is simply information. There is so much good news. The fact that it is now cheaper in most parts of the world to put up a renewable energy plant than a fossil fuel energy plant, that's amazing. No one thought that was possible 10 years ago at the speed with which it's happened. So the technology, we're seeing real movement in the technology. We're seeing lots of individual examples that are really encouraging. You know, I talk about some in my book, but as you know, one of my favorites is the tale of Erik Osmundsson at Norsk Gjenvinning in Scandinavia, who became the CEO of a waste company because he knew that if we could build a circular economy, if we could think of waste as a source of raw materials rather than just burying it in the hole in the ground, then that could transform, not only the waste industry, but make a major contribution to climate change. So he's very idealistic. He's a lovely guy. And he took over the company and discovered that, the industry was thoroughly corrupt. People were throwing garbage into holes in the ground and shipping it illegally to developing nations labeled as medical waste. I mean, it was really labeling medical waste as ordinary waste. I mean, horrible stuff was happening. And he decided to do it differently. And it wasn't easy. Half of his senior team quit. Many of his customers left him. He got death threats from his competitors, which is pretty wild. He had to have police protection for his family. But, there is a better way to run most businesses. And we have a lot of research that suggests that's the case. For example, many people would much rather work for a business whose purpose is not maximizing profits, but making a difference in the world. So yes, you have to make money, you have to make profits. This is capitalism. You have to have cash flow to survive, but that shouldn't be the goal of the firm. That should be the means to an end. So for Erik, staying profitable was absolutely necessary. Otherwise, he would lose his investors in the business. But the goal was transforming the waste business. And when the goal is something like that, and people can see you're serious about it, what happens? Well, you get what's called intrinsic motivation. People are working not just for their paycheck, although everybody needs a decent paycheck, but because they're going to make a difference for their kids. And that can increase motivation enormously. What else do you get? You get strategic alignment. Like everyone is, okay, I get the program. Why don't we try this? Why don't we try that? You get the ability to empower the workforce because people are motivated and they know where you're going. And that lets you build a lot of trust. And if you have trust, you can push decisions down to the people on the ground who know what's going on. What does that do? That significantly raises productivity and creativity. There's this finding I talk about in the book, and as I say, I was part of a group of economists who spent 20 years in windowless conference rooms trying to make this result go away because it was so unexpected. And the result was this. In the average industry, the top 10% most productive firms are more than twice as productive as the least. after you control for differences in input and labor quality and everything you can think of. That was the 20 years in windowless conference rooms. That is, the most productive firms take the same input and get more than double the output. Like, wow, how do they do that? High performance work systems, which is a fancy way of saying treat people like real people, not cogs in the machine, pay them decently, promote them on the merit, trust them, empower them, work in teams. And you can completely transform how the firm works. Now, I'm not saying that's easy. It took Eric many years to get that. But he found that when people were really focused, you could do the right thing and build a recycling business that was a significant competitive advantage in the industry. He's now got one of the largest and most successful recycling firms in Scandinavia. He's not super, super rich. He's not Elon Musk, but he's very proud of what he's done. And he would be the first person to say, if he were on this podcast with us, it was the whole team. It was the whole team. It was because everyone got involved. And I've seen that model in firm after firm. And so how do we build on that? We start doing it. And if we're politicians, we favor those kinds of firms. We write the rules such that firms that manage that way have the advantage. Good labor relations, good labor regulation means it's better to manage that way. But we build on these successes and we build public-private partnerships so that government and firms work together. We build cooperation amongst firms so that those issues that are too hard to do on your own, like addressing deforestation, which is super important and super hard, and no single firm can do on its own. You get every firm in the meatpacking business to say, okay, no more deforestation. You do that in palm oil, you do that in timber. And you try and get this kind of collective action. And then last but not least, of course, we need a major political and cultural movement and social movement to revitalize our democracy and rebalance our society. So that's like an easy thing to say. It's super hard to do. But I don't want to leave our listeners thinking that, a few firms changing can do all the heavy lifting. No, there's a lot of work to be done, but business can be a part of that. Can show that these kinds of changes are profitable, can demonstrate that the technology works, can sort of get away from this myth that the only way to make money is to treat people like dirt and dump your waste on everyone else. And that's really important. That's a big contribution, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. And I really like that you answered one of my biggest questions with what you just said, that there is this dissonance between our perception of getting and earning profits, good profits, and that being in tension and being a constant tug of war between passion, between purpose and profits. And like you argue right now, profits can really be enhanced by a purpose, can be really enhanced by, having a North Star that not only involves myself, it involves my team, it involves my consumers, it involves my whole organization, and it involves my planet as well, like you say. And another example that you mention in your book, Reimagining Capitalism, is Unilever, and how they really have improved their revenues by embracing this sustainability approach and to the market, and they've priced it into their tea production. And this is a segue into a consumer standpoint. This is me as, if I go to the grocery store right now and I see this product that says this is organic, this is sustainably produced, all of those labels. How can we identify from our standpoint these companies that really are purpose-driven to support them, but at the same time prevent us from falling into the trap of what is being now called as greenwashing?
Sure. So if we're to make this transition, if more of us as consumers and employees, because employees have a huge role to play in pushing firms too, if we're to persuade firms to do the right thing, we have to have decent information. And at the moment, there are thousands of different kinds of standards. And I see that this package is rainforest certified, and this one is Forest Stewardship Council. And as a consumer, how do I know? Super hard. And this is also true, paradoxically, for another important group, which is investors, right? There are many people who want to see their pension funds or their investments go towards firms that are doing the right thing. And there are some investors who just want to know which firms are doing the right thing because they think they're the smart firms, because they can see how the world is changing and they're getting out in front of some of these big changes. And those are the firms that are going to be making the money. So there's a big demand from many, many constituencies for decent measures. So on this front, there's good news and bad news, okay? So the good news is lots and lots of people understand this. And the whole fuss about what's called ESG, environmental, social, and governance metrics, is a fight about this issue, which is you tell me you're going to go to zero greenhouse gas emissions by 2050, show me the measure. And let's make sure that's audited, right? It's no good if I tell you what my measure is because, I might not be completely accurate. Let's be polite. But, you need someone else to come in and say, yes, Henderson Inc. is emitting, this much greenhouse gases and it's gone down over time. So we need measures that everyone can understand, that are common across firms, that can be audited, and that are replicable. That is, you can go back year after year and see what's happened with those measures. And you need measures that mean something, right? Because it's possible to go in and measure all kinds of things. Like, suppose you're trying to measure whether a firm treats its employees well. What would you measure? Average pay level? Turnover? Education, like how much training you do? Scores on sites like Glassdoor, which say whether people like working there? The internal employee survey? I mean, this is a hard question. These are really hard questions. Even measuring carbon emissions or greenhouse gas emissions turns out to be super difficult because is it my carbon emissions? What about the carbon emissions that went into the products that I use to make my product? At Harvard, where I was co-chair of the Harvard Committee on Climate Operations, we were able to cut our direct carbon emissions, that is, the greenhouse gases that were generated by things like heating the buildings, by 40% and make money every step of the way, which was very cool. But then we did the analysis of how much carbon was burned, how much carbon was emitted to make the steel and cement in the buildings. And that turns out to be way bigger. So, when we say Harvard's emissions, what are Harvard's emissions? And, maybe that was counted when the carbon, it gets very complicated. So I'm saying good news, lots of people are focused on this. Big problem has to be fixed. Bad news, hard problem. But, all of this is hard. I mean, I don't want to suggest to our listeners that simply announcing you're a purpose-driven company is going to guarantee improvements in productivity and creativity. No, no, no. You have to think it through. You have to persuade your colleagues. You have to embody it in how you structure the work. It's all of this is hard, but hey, that's what humans do. We solve hard problems. And what's our alternative? Just let climate change and social destruction rage unchecked? Bad idea. So this is eminently solvable. I mean, 100 years ago, accounting was a total mess. I think I give the example in the book of in the 30s, Procter & Gamble's annual report contained the following paragraph. Our revenue was, 27 million. And our income was, 4 million. Stockholders wanting further information about the financials can apply in person to our headquarters in Cincinnati. I mean, that was the financial reporting. And it took, a long time to get that locked into place. So we shouldn't be surprised that this is going to take time. The good news is there's a lot of energy and attention focused on it. And we can see how this could be done. It's not insurmountable. It's just a hard problem.
And one of to add to the equation of this complicated challenge is that time is of the essence. Time still is clicking and, not to become very, in a nervous way, but we've seen how the doomsday clock continues to trickle down into midnight, which, of course, as someone who wishes to continue to grow and wishes to create, prosperity for my unborn family is concerning, and it can be overwhelming, like if all of these problems are already a tsunami behind me, then what can I do? So with having that in mind, the equation of time, and having in mind that it's solvable, what are some of the quickest steps you're noticing now that we're taking? And what are some of the ones you'd wish we'd see more in our society to solve this challenge?
So can I start by talking about the personal level, what individuals can do? Because in a conversation like this, it can so often seem as if other people should fix this problem. The politicians, the CEOs. But in reality, you know who's going to fix this problem? We are. And while it's true that no single individual can, invent the solution, unless maybe the person who makes fusion work, and even that's a group effort, we know that massive social change of the kind we're talking about is driven by millions of people working together. The analogy I like to use is that we need an avalanche, and avalanches are started by pebbles. No one knows which single pebble started the avalanche. We just know we need lots of pebbles to start moving. And so, if you say to me, and let's for a moment concentrate on this, what can an individual do? So I think the most important thing is, to quote The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, do not panic. Our whole world is so caught up in rush and stress and despair, and it's very hard to act well from that place of burnout and fear. So sometimes I think the best thing to do is take care of yourself in a fundamental way. And I mean it. Enough sleep, making sure you do at least some experiences that give you that feeling of groundedness and connectedness, walking in nature, dancing with friends, hugging your children, meditating if you have, some kind of ritual or religious practice, something that reconnects us to really what it means to be human. And I know you've talked about this in other podcasts, but the more I do this work, the more important I think it is. Because the people who make a difference are not panicking. They're standing strong. They know that no single individual can make a difference, but they also know that that doesn't excuse them from acting. And they're thinking sensibly, what can I do? Where can I make the most difference? I think the example I gave you for some factories are twice as productive as others holds for humans. That if you're crazy and burnt out and running around too far, you're not going to get much done. So paradoxically, it's really important to slow down and focus and be grounded and know where you're coming from. So then what should you do? Well, 3 things: personal, professional, political. What can you do as a person? You can do the basics. Fly less, eat less meat. If you have a house and you can afford it, put solar panels on the roof and insulate it. These may seem like small things, but they're strong signals to people around you. There's a phenomenon called social contagion, particularly where if you talk about why you're doing these things and you're not angry or aggressive, you're sympathetic. None of us is perfect. I know very well. I use a ton of carbon. Tell people what you're doing and why. Tell them about the science, not with anger and fear, but like, we have this problem. This is why I'm doing this. So that's the personal. Professionally, where do you work? It's so easy to think that, whoa, it was the CEO at Unilever who decided to change his firm and he made this big difference. And he was, and the current CEO too, is an amazing human being. Absolutely. Getting CEOs in line is fantastic. But I can't tell you the number of CEOs I know, including the CEO of Unilever, who was able to do what he did or what she did because of people below them who were experimenting, who were trying to make a difference inside the organization. At Unilever, I tell the story of Michel Legence, who revolutionized the tea business at Unilever by making it sustainable. Why? Because he had a great business case. He thought it would persuade consumers to buy Unilever tea, which it did. He had to fight many layers of the corporate bureaucracy to do that because they were like, you want to do what? This is way before it was fashionable. But when Paul Polman, the new CEO, came in and looked around for I'd like to do sustainability, but do we have anything going? Michel's effort was one he looked at. It's like, oh, see, this can be done. So you can make a difference in the organization where you work. It's so often, my students sometimes say, well, what can I do? And I say, one day a CEO is going to walk into your office like 2 or 3 years after you graduate and say, people are bugging me about labor quality. Like, what does that mean? What should we do? Who does the actual work in most organizations? The young people. So professionally, you can make a big difference. And then politically, as I said, we won't get where we're going without a political movement. We need our leaders in every sector to act. Why will they act? Because we get in their face. So that great American phrase, make trouble, make good trouble, make polite trouble, but make trouble. We should all be doing that. And that's going to make a big difference too.
Absolutely. And you touched on so many brilliant ideas, so thank you for that. And the last one that you just touched on is politics. And I don't want to get into politics really that much, but it's a relevant question because we're entering a political cycle, a presidential election in the next year here in the United States. So I'm curious to know, what do you wish to see from our elected leaders or, presumptive elected officials who want to get elected? And what are you seeing now? And is there really this balance in terms of, your wishes on what's happening in the conversation between sustainability and capitalism and fixing these externalities? Or are you seeing the same rhetoric of the same politicians, just all different faces saying, these problems are non-existent, and if you vote for me, I'll just, deliver for my base?
So I don't want to get too political, but my view of the current political dynamics in the US is that one party has rather lost its way. My first husband was a Republican, and I have great respect for what I would have called traditional Republicans. That is fiscally conservative, socially liberal, focused on individual freedoms. I think there are members of the current Republican Party who have really lost touch with truth. I'm deeply disturbed about what I would call the big lie, that the last election was won by President Trump when no one has produced any rigorous evidence that this was the case. No lawsuit, nothing has ever really shown us that this was an issue, and yet people continue to repeat it. And an apparent willingness to focus not on the needs of the whole society in the long term, but on a particular segment of it. Now, I'm not saying the Democrats are lily white here. Every political party has issues and problems, but at least the current Democratic Party is talking about climate change, is talking about inequality, has passed some legislation which I think will make a major difference. I would love it if the Republican Party embraced the idea that climate change is a big problem. I know several senior Republicans who understand this and are pushing their party to change. And many young Republicans absolutely understand that climate change is an issue and the party should be focused on that. So, if anyone is listening as a Republican, this is fantastic. You have such great opportunity to make a difference, because the conversation, what should we do about climate change, is a very different conversation from does climate change exist and is it important? So here again, I think we can make a difference in the current conversation. But yeah, at the moment, it's not so great.
Really interesting. Switching gears a bit, your book, Reimagining Capitalism, was released in 2020. The moment the world stood still, the moment everyone just paused and the pandemic hit us, which was a very stark, I don't want to say it, but it was a very stark advertising for a world of fire, Reimagining Capitalism. So I'm curious, Professor Henderson, in hindsight, it's been 3 years since the pandemic began and since you released your book. And we've seen how, and you've argued in previous occasions that the pandemic unleashed or unfolded on or revealed our flaws, our economic system flaws. Do you think right now in hindsight, 3 years, is this holding true still? And do you think we've touched on love and compassion and, our humanity too? Do you think the pandemic fueled our desire for more human businesses, more human-driven businesses, more mindful businesses versus igniting our hunger for more profit and more greed?
is so complex, right? The pandemic's had so many effects, and globally, it's had very different effects. I think in many ways, the idea that it shows up capitalism flaws seems to be correct. The fact that who got the vaccines? The rich countries got the vaccines. Who died from COVID? The poor died from COVID. Overwhelmingly, it was people who didn't have access to adequate healthcare or, pre-existing conditions that died, although not all. I mean, I had friends who died too. It was a disaster in so many dimensions. Did it make us think more about the general good and where we're trying to get to? I think it's almost bipolar. That for some people, the pandemic was a wake-up call. That not going into work every day, spending more time with the family, really, for those who are fortunate enough to be able to work at home, really led to a reevaluation of what they wanted from their jobs and their lives. In some companies, I know CEOs who realized that they were literally responsible for their employees' lives, and that really changed how they thought about how they managed. Realizing that many essential workers didn't have healthcare or enough cash to be able to stay home if they were sick, I think really changed many people's views of what's important. But at the same time, COVID has made our world poorer and rougher. And when the world seems dangerous, a part of the human brain reverts to fear and taking care of myself first. And I think we certainly see that too. And I think we'll look back and think we lost a lot of precious time because the pandemic hit. And we sort of said, okay, well, we don't have to work on climate change. We have this other issue to focus on. But, sometimes I think I see a wall of suffering coming towards us. And I look around and I think, why are people more concerned? And I hope that COVID wakes people up in the sense that the future can be different from the current day, that really bad things can happen and many people can suffer. And we should work now to try and avert that. I hope that's what the pandemic does.
Yeah, like you say, and like we've been discussing, there is momentum, there is positive momentum here, and we can really capture it to create more momentum for more people and build upon that. And, we could have a 3-hour-long conversation, I'm very sure, and hopefully we can have another one in the future to discuss more in depth, more topics. And you mentioned, this idea of the future, the abstract future, and all of us have our hopes and our dreams and our visions of making it a very better future for all of us. I think no one would argue against this idea that I want my future to be worse than my past. There is no way. So, Professor, what are some of the future trends in businesses, in politics, that excite you the most?
I think artificial intelligence is really exciting. That if, as a society, we could learn to control it and make it a servant to human well-being rather than merely another way to make money, the potential of the technology is astounding. I'm really excited by the number of young people who think that we need to find another way. I think that's really exciting. I'm excited by the number of older people who think we need to find another way. Before my book was published, the publishers were really nervous about the title. This business about a world on fire, that didn't sound, scholarly business school professor. And indeed, the English edition, the first edition, came out with Reimagining Capitalism, How Business Can Save the World, which is not a title I liked at all. But it turned out that the world was on fire. And lots of people can see that. So I'm really excited and encouraged by that too. Alex, I need to jump.
Yes, thank you so much for joining me, Professor Henderson. I'm looking forward to, the comments of our listeners and also for them to read your book and visit your ideas. And hopefully we can do this in the future one more time.
That would be fun. It's really been a great pleasure to talk. Thank you very, very much.
Thank you.